Hello everyone, I am 𝓒𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to 𝓒𝓱𝓪𝓾𝓱𝓪. Now in this video, I'll explain the theme 4 of class 11th history that belongs to the section 2nd of class 11th history. Now the theme that we have got here is the Central Islamic lands. So the Central Islamic lands. Now basically in this chapter we'll talk about the Islamic religion, how Islam emerged, like we'll talk about Prophet Muhammad and how the Islamic religion was established, who were the caliphates that ruled over it, and how different things, how different opinions were formed. Now Islam in this chapter does not mean only the religion but the overall development in social, economic and political ways. So basically in this chapter we will be talking about Central Islamic lands. Here means that Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Now that Arabian Peninsula is the Middle East, that in the central part. So that is why we'll be calling it as the Central Islamic lands. Now in the last theme we had ended our story at the late antiquity, in which we saw that the eastern part of Roman Empire was now being conquered by the Arabian Empire or by the Islamic Empire. Now that Islamic Empire, or mainly that was not established as an empire but just as a religion, how it emerged to be so powerful we'll talk about in this chapter, as it was the biggest political revolution in the ancient, that the history of the Islam religion is from the 600 AD to 1200 AD. So after 1200 AD the medieval period came up. So this was the biggest political revolution ever in the ancient history of the world. So basically in this chapter we'll be looking at the history of all those who belong to Islam religion, that is Muslims. Now if we talk about the present status of the Muslims or those who follow Islam religion, then there are 1.9 billion Muslims all over the world, and that account for 24% as well of the total population and become the second largest religious community or religion of the world. Now that these Muslims belong to different countries, even speak different languages in different dialects, like it can be the same language but with different dialects. They even dress differently, living in different countries. There are some who are in tribal communities as well, so they have many differences among them as well, even though they belong to the same religion, and it's a very normal thing. But they do share one thing common, that is their unified past. Around 1400 years ago, how they were folded, how they emerged, how the past was shaped. So basically in this chapter we will be talking about those Muslims who share the total that unified past history. We'll talk about theirs. Now before even stating about the history of the Islam religion, we should know the sources from which we find these evidences, because without evidence history is nothing. History is just fantasy, imagination, your thinking, your thoughts. But if we have the evidence, it becomes a history. So history is mainly relied on evidences. Now evidences of the history of the Islam religion becomes there are many sources of history. Like for example, we found chronicles or tarikhs. Now chronicles, tarikh is that Arabic word. In Arabic language it means then in order. So chronicles or tarikhs, as they were written in order over time. Then for semi-historical period we have different sources, like for example we have commentaries on Quran, and it was written, as it was given, you could say, by Prophet Muhammad. So we have commentaries on Quran, and we also have some biographies of the people. Now those biographies are biographies, but that biographies are mainly stated at one person, but in what area, in which area he is living, he will definitely tell about the circumstances of his life as well, from which we can see that social life of their economic prosperity as well. We can see different spheres of life from biographies as well. So biographies that are said in Arabic language, and we have some some written documents, written essays or some documents about the life of Prophet Muhammad and his doings that are commonly known as hadith. So hadith were mainly the writings about the doings and about the life of Prophet Muhammad. So there are many sources of history for historical period as well as semi-historical period of Islam religion. Besides that, these sources were found, these were written, these were made, but even their source of report, you could say that even their source of information was reliable. Like for example, in early days, what happened that they were eyewitnesses who had seen the history being done. Then they would pass it to their generations, and the authenticity of that particular information is also traced through transmissions, so that the information that we have is reliable. So you could say that in simple terms, you might have seen that in many families, what happens that from generation to generation, a particular information is passed. So you could say that those are passed either through writings or through oral. So for their reliability, for their that they are also traced through transmissions. So that the first person who passed it might be related. Like we can trace it back to the transmission and can find whether they were true or not. So in simple terms, there were many eyewitnesses. You could say that they were either passed orally or by writing. There were many documents they were found. Besides that, we have some fragmented parts of documents, written documents as well. Either they were letters, speeches, contracts, private correspondence as well. Besides that, we have numismatic. Now, numismatic is the study of coins, and epigraphy is a study of inscriptions. Like we have so many archaeological excavations for finding the sources of history as well. Through archaeology, we find so many inscriptions, papyri, Greek Egypt papyri, and Greek written records, Gangia records that we'll talk about later in this chapter. So you could say that there were many sources of history as well. Now, in 19th century, in proper terms, the history of Muslims was written by the professors of universities in many of the countries, in many of the European countries. Well, there was a reason behind it as well. During the 18th century, colonialism was at its pinnacle of power. Like it was spreading so much. Britain and France were becoming so great enemies, rivals of each other. So you could say that during that time, colonialism was so common thing, such a common thing, and to rule over the people. Like they commonly ruled in the Middle East and in the African regions. So there Muslim is very popular. You could say so much of the population is Muslim, belongs to Muslim community as well. So to know their past was also very important to rule over them. So that is why many professors were interested in the history of those Muslims, and many Christian priests were also very interested because they wanted to compare the beliefs of Islamic religion to their religion. It is said that in Islam, the first beliefs were made by Abraham, Moses, or Jesus. These names have been written in the Islamic community as well. So they were kind of same, you could say the same generation they were made. Now the Christian priests wanted to know the history of the Muslims because they wanted to compare it to their own religion. And in 20th century, these histories, these books, these contents were in more, you could say that in more standard ways, in more civilized ways, as more technology was being introduced. So as in 20th century, there was a period of industrialization, urbanization, and through so many technologies, books were also written. So you could say that there were many sources of history for the Muslim community. And in historical period, there were a writer, you could say, whose name was Al-Tabari. Now Al-Tabari had written also, that was also very important. So you could say that there were many books, many tarikhs, chronicles that were the sources of the history of Muslim community or the Arabian Peninsula, Islamic Empire, Islam religion, whatever you want to call it. Now let's get into the chapter with the first topic, that is the rise of Islam in Arabia, faith, community, and politics. So the rise of Islam in Arabia, faith, community and politics. Now first let's talk about faith, community and politics. What do you mean even by them? We'll talk about them. Now Arabia, as always known that Arab region was the region, Arabian Peninsula was the region from where Islam emerged as a religion, but there was a history behind it as well. Now what happened that all of you might know that Prophet Muhammad who was the one who established the religion, but how? Do you even know why? Now in 570 AD he was born. Prophet Muhammad was born in a very prominent family of Quraysh tribe of Arabian Peninsula, because during that time in Arabian Peninsula there were so many you could say that so many tribes, or what we call kafilas. Now in Arab language, Arabic language, it is kafila, but we know them as tribes. So there were so many tribes in which there were clans as well. So Muhammad, you could say that Prophet Muhammad was born in a very prominent family, but 6 months before his you could say that before he was born, his father died, and after 6 years when he was born, his mother also died. So his responsibility was on the hands of his uncle, now whose name was Abbas. So you could say that in 570 AD he was born. AD, that is Anno Domini, or after the Christ Common Era, you could say. So he was born in that period and he got enlightenment as well. Like for example, during that time in Arabian region there were so many tribes, and each tribe had its own shrine for the worship of god and goddesses. In those shrines there were so many idols placed for which each tribe were praying. So you could see that during that times there were so many idols, there were so many shrines of idols, you could say. Now after that, you know what, that Prophet Muhammad got his enlightenment in the mountain Hira, or cave Hira we know it, and it is said that there he saw angel, he could say that, whose name was Angel Gabriel. So he saw Angel Gabriel there and got his enlightenment, and in 612 AD he declared himself as the messenger of the God, or what we call Rasul in Arabic language. So he was a Rasul of the God, or the messenger of the God, and he said that we have just one common God, that is Allah. So he gave his belief that there is one supreme God, common God, and that is Allah. We should believe in him. He has asked me to to spread his beliefs. So after getting enlightenment there, he spread there like that, and that was the faith part. You know what, that for any religion to be emerged, what is important? First is to have faith, like to have belief in those beliefs that are being made. There are many people, like you could say that there are many beliefs by the person who emerged as the first person in that religion. Then second is a community, like there should be believers of those beliefs as well. Like if there is Islamic religion, there should be Muslims as well, because without them it can be stand out. So we need to have community as well, and politics, of course. If these two things are with same like they are combined, there will be politics lot of going on as well. So you could say that this Prophet Muhammad said that there is one Allah, and those who were believing in his beliefs, like those who believed in Allah, were now known as Ummah. Like those believers, the community which were believing in this were known as Ummah. So you could say that now he had faith and community as well. Many people were now believing him. Now one thing is here that in his Quraysh tribe, what happened that in Quraysh tribe there was a most famous shrine of the god, that is Kaaba. Now Kaaba was considered to be holiest, purest place among those tribes of Arabian Peninsula, and that is why pilgrimage from so many far distances annually came there. So the economic sphere of the Arabian Peninsula was like that, it was very limited. Like there was only trade going on and only pilgrimage. So the incomes of the people were based on pilgrimage or either in trade. So these two were the only, you could say, that economic spheres activities going on in the Arabian Peninsula. Now in Makkah region he was born. Like I have skipped this point that this Prophet Muhammad was born in the Makkah region. Now he was born in Mecca, and many Meccans were now believing him, and those were known as Ummah as well. But now what happened that those affluent Meccans were against it, because if that happened, like if all the people believed in just one God, then how would the pilgrimage business go on for those affluent Meccans? So now they were against this belief, and finally in 622 AD Prophet Muhammad had to escape and had to go to a different region that came to be known as Medina. Now what happened that during these years, what happened that his wife who was supporting him, his uncle who was supporting him, had now been killed off, had now died because of so many criticisms, because of those affluent Meccans, and now his support was also being lost. So you could say that is why he had to escape from Mecca to a region known as Medina. Now when he reached there, it was only known as Ephraim. Now that region was known as Ephraim, and that came to be known as Medina later. So you could say that he went there with his Ummah, you could say that with that community that believe in them, because consolidation is very important thing to maintain the survivors who were believing in him was very important, and that is why he had to escape. Like he couldn't live there, could he? Like even if he wanted, like if his belief was that he would not live because of this, but what about his survivors? He would have to consolidate his survivors as well. So he went to Medina region, and there he established, like that was the point where Islam was emerged, like spread so much, because in Ephraim, in Medina region, there were so many tribal communities, like there were so many tribes, and those tribes were believing in Prophet Muhammad. Now those tribes believed in all of his values, beliefs, and even converted themselves as ummas, like converted themselves as an Islamic religion. And most important one of them were Bedouins. Now Bedouins were the nomadic tribes, and they were generally found in the desert areas. They were also very impressed and also converted themselves into this religion. So from Medina, when Prophet Muhammad went there, he found so much like his religion, Islam was spread this so much, you could say that is why Medina became the religious, you could say that religious capital of it as well. Now what happened that their business, like they had, like it is okay to have religion, but what about economic activities? We need to have income to survive on as well. So those economic activities were being performed by the Medina, by those people living in Medina region. Now those were only relying on trade or taxes, or you could say that sometimes what happened that when Meccans were going from that region, from Medina region, because Medina is just approximately 200 miles away from Mecca region, so it was not that far away. Of course during that time it was, but now we can't say that it was too much. So during that time, whenever a cart passed through Medina and that was of affluent Meccans, then definitely it was raided by the Medina people, like Ummas and different tribes of Medina, and that is why those Meccans had reaction as well, because those were now provoking them. So many wars were done, and in the name of Prophet Muhammad, finally Mecca was conquered. So you could see that now Prophet Muhammad had established his religion, and all over the Arab region it was spread, like people were converted themselves. It was not like that all the people converted, but yeah, there were Jews as well, there were Christians as well, but yeah, most people had converted themselves as Muslims, or we would not call them Muslims, but now Ummas, because during that time it was a term that was used. So you could say that Prophet Muhammad had established this religion, had spread the view that he was a messenger of God, he was asked to do these things, and people also believed in his ideas because they were giving sense, you could say that they were in sense of humor, survival, and the people believe in it. So you could say that now Mecca was established, Mecca was conquered, and now Mecca became the religious capital and Medina became the administrative capital of Prophet Muhammad, because that time when he went to Medina was a time when his religion spread just too much, you could say. Now the second topic here is that the caliphate, expansion, civil wars, and sect formation. So the caliphate, expansion, civil wars, and the sect formation. Now what happened that after 632 AD? Now in 632 AD, Prophet Muhammad died, and now no one could legitimately to call himself as a prophet. Like no one legitimately had right to call himself as a prophet, as Prophet Muhammad had not chosen anyone as his successor for, you could say that, for becoming the prophet of Islamic religion. Prophet, what do you mean by prophet? Prophet, like in Arabic language, it is known as pagambar. So you could say that after the death of Prophet Muhammad, now no one could be successor, and that is why succession for the post of prophet was now in the hands of ummas. Now ummas, those believers community, now those ummah would now choose the ruler, you could say that the prophet, you could say. But there was problem as well. Like there were two people who wanted to become the there was a, now you could say that during this period there were innovations as well as some losses. Innovation was that a new post was declared, that was of caliphate. Now caliphate, that is a deputy of the prophet. Now you could say the caliphate was not the, you could say that the highest one, was not the messenger of God, but the deputy of the messenger of God. So you could say that the caliphate was the deputy of, you could say, Prophet Muhammad or the prophet. Now there were two people who wanted to become the first caliphate. Now that were munimin, and the second was Ali. Now of the munimin and Ali, those two had their own favors by the ummas, by different people. But you could say Abd al-Munimin had majority and Ali had minority, like less people he had his in favor, and that is why it also acted as sex formation. As you know what, that those who supported al-Munimin came to be known as Sunni Muslims, and those who wanted to support Ali came to be known as Shia Muslims. Later on they were called Muslims, but during that time they were sects. So those communities were known as Sunni, those who were believing or supporting al-Munimin, and those who were supporting Ali were known as Shia. So you could say now sect was formed among the ummas. Like there were two kind of people, two groups that were formed. Now you know that first four caliphates are what we call caliphs. Like in English we call it caliph, but in Arabic language there is a word khalifa. So that khalifa I'm talking about, you could say that those caliphs, the first four caliphs, are known as Rashidun caliphs, because they were somehow, you could say that those first four caliphs were somehow connected to the first prophet, like you could say that to the Prophet Muhammad by bloodline, you could say. Now you know what, that people wanted someone from the bloodline of Prophet Muhammad to be the first caliphate, and that is why majority of the people were in the support of al-Munimin, because he was the father-in-law of you could say Prophet Muhammad. Like Prophet Muhammad's youngest wife, whose name was Aisha, he was the Aisha's father. So you could say that the youngest wife of Prophet Muhammad's father, that was Abd al-Munimin, became the first caliph. He ruled from 632 AD to 634 AD. During that time the main focus was on the expansion, you could say. Like during 2 years he could not do so much, but yeah, you know what, that after the death of Prophet Muhammad, what happened, that many tribes who had joined themselves in this community of Ummah were now disintegrating, and what they did was that they were now even claiming themselves as the prophets, like someone from their community, from their tribe, as a prophet, because now no one legitimately could tell himself or post himself as the prophet. So now they were even giving someone the post of prophet. So many communities could disintegrate more and more. That is why those revolts of those tribes were surpassed by the first caliph. Second caliph, that is Umar. He ruled from the period of 634 to 644 CE. Now during these 10 years, what he did was that he did the expansion, because the economic, like the national treasury of the Arabian Peninsula was getting low and low, because no economic activities were being that much in that region. That is why they thought that the rich booty, or what we call that ghanima in Arabic language, you could say ghanima, that they call during that time. So rich booty, expedition raids, and all those from the military campaigns could be, like if they conquered a country, all the resources of that country would be theirs and could be added to the national treasury. So that is why more focus was on the expansion of the territory, you could say, of the Islamic religion, Islamic, you could say the Arabian Peninsula would be better to call it. Now the third caliph, you could say that the third caliph during this time, you know what, that during the period of 637 AD to 642 AD, there was so much expansion. Now you know what, that in the west of Arabian Peninsula lies Roman Empire, and the eastern part of Roman Empire, that was known as Byzantine Empire, was now conquered by the Islamic Empire, or we can call it Arabian Peninsula. And the you could say that the Iranian Empire, that was lying in the eastern part of Roman Empire, over where Sasanians were ruling, was also being conquered by the Arabian Peninsula or the Islamic Empire. The main reason was that, you know what, that in Roman Empire, as we talked about the Emperor Constantine, he declared Christianity as the official religion. Now what happened, that in Roman Empire, Christianity was the main religion. In Iran, the main religion was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is a very, you could say that first religion of Iran. So these two were the religions, and there were so many internal conflicts because of these religions, because those high class aristocracies were against it. Many aristocracies were creating conflicts, internal conflicts as well. So that is why it made possible for the Islamic Empire to rule over them. That is why between the period of 637 to 642 CE, these areas were conquered, and after that the third caliph who came over power was Uthman. Now Uthman, who came into power, you could say that from 645 or 644 to 651. No, not 651, it's 656. During this period he ruled. Now he included many policies. What they did was that you could say that the main thing was that he included coin system. You could say that many coins were introduced, and much more expansion was done. Like so much expansion was done, many regions were conquered as well, and many things were like so many conquered territories were happening, and those were also not like all the money was in the national treasury. The salary was paid to the military commanders as well, and we had talked about Bedouins. Now those Bedouins were in charge of the commander. You could say that in military they were included. So they rested in the camps that were in desert areas, where they could be touched with their natural habitat as well as their ummas or the caliphs. You could say it would be better to call it caliph. So they were in the touch of both, because during that time there weren't any phones were there, so they could call the king or the caliph. So it was very important for them to keep in touch with those caliphs as well. So that is why they were in desert region, in such a situation that they were related to the natural habitat as well as the caliphs. Now besides that, all those who were non-Muslims, they were like Christian or Jews, you could say, or those from Iran region, could live in those regions in Arabian Peninsula, in Islamic Empire. They could even retain their rights, like you could say that right to property, right to propagate the religion, but they would have to give some tax to the government or to the caliphs for their protection. So you could say that those communities like Christians, Jews were now under the protected communities. They were the protected communities of the caliphs. So you could say that taxes were also included during the caliph era, you could say. Now after which what happened, that you could say that these all things happened, but what happened that their fourth caliph also came up, whose name was Ali. Now who wanted the first post? You know that he wanted to be the first caliph but became the fourth caliph in the Rashidun Caliph. Now he was the caliph from 656 to 661 AD. Well, he would have to, like in 657 AD, he had to fight a battle, that was Battle of Kamar, and he had defeated the other party. The other party was led by Aisha. You might remember, she was the youngest wife of Prophet Muhammad. So she was defeated, but this caliph Ali could not defeat the faction led by Muawiyah. Now Muawiyah was the governor of Syria and also a loyal caliph of the earlier caliph. So you could say that he was the governor of Syria and had made his own faction that could not be suppressed by this caliph Ali. And what happened that, like they were standing, like they were ready for the battle, they were standing in front of each other like for the battle, but no one was taking the initiative. Like for example, if there is a border, the one party is standing, he is here and the other party is here, but none of them is taking the initiative. What are they even doing? They are just standing in front of each other. So no one was taking initiative, and that is why they ended without even a war. Like they had signed some agreement, they had done it with peace. That caused a conflict for the Caliph Ali. Now what happened that many people became divided, many Ummas became divided. Some became loyal to him, like loyal to Caliph Ali, but some were against him, like they wanted to fight against Muawiyah. He wanted, like they had their own beliefs. They were known as 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. Now 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 were the one who assassinated this caliph who was Ali. So Ali was assassinated by one of the 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪s. It is 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. So you could say that he was assassinated, and after which Muawiyah came into power. What happened that his succession was still being done, like his descendants were taking away, like his sons were now wanted to be caliph, but Muawiyah took the opportunity and established his own dynasty that was known as Umayyads dynasty. So let's talk about the Umayyads dynasty with the next topic as well, that is the Umayyads and the centralization of polity. So the Umayyads and the centralization of polity. Now what happened that Muawiyah came into power and established his own dynasty that was known as Umayyads dynasty. Now this he also declared himself the caliph, but now he was not a part of Rashidun caliphs. The first four caliphs were the only one who were the Rashidun caliphs. After that we would not call them as the Rashidun caliphs. So now he became the caliph and established so many policies that most important one of them was centralization of polity. As Islamic empire, and we will not call them Islamic empire, but Islamic religion had spread so much, you could say, like so much of the part had been conquered, and that is why it was also very hard to rule over such a big territory, and that is why he wanted to centralize so much power to himself, and that is why centralization of polity was done. Besides that, coinage were also introduced by himself. Now there were two kind of coins that were introduced. First one was dinar. Dinar was a golden coin that was derived or taken from a Roman coin that was, like you could say that, in which they were the same but different things. Second coin in this region, in Arabian Peninsula, in this caliph, was that was known as 𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪. Now this 𝓥𝓲𝓫 was a silver coin. So a golden coin and a silver coin was introduced, and that was not by this Muawiyah, that was another emperor. Not the emperor, it was the caliph, by another caliph who was Abd al-Malik. So Abd al-Malik was the one who introduced coins in the Arabian Peninsula, in the Islamic empire. Now Muawiyah did one more very important thing, was that after him the succession would be done by his son. Like for example, after that he started a dynasty. So in dynasty what happens that a son takes after his father, then his sons take, then his sons take. So cycle would keep going on in a dynasty. He started the same thing, that succession would be made on hereditary basis. That is, there would be hereditary basis of succession, and many Muslims believed it as well. And besides that, he had so much faith, like the Umayyads had so much faith in the military commanders of Syria region, and many Christians were also included in the court, the royal court you could say, and many other people, like you could say many other people like those Zoroastrians and Jews were included as the bureaucrats and scribes of the royal court. So you could say that many new things happened during the Umayyads policy. You could say that during the Umayyads dynasty, many things happened. One of the things that happened was that they made a dome, you could say a dome of rock in Jerusalem. Now, when we talk about the Islamic Empire or the Islamic religion, there are very important 4 cities that we must remember. First is Mecca, then is Medina, then is Jerusalem, and then is Damascus. You might not know that, but when this Muawiyah came into power, he made the Damascus as the royal capital of the city, because he was the governor of Syria earlier. So now that is why he declared the Damascus as the capital city, because he had so much popularity over Damascus after all. So in Umayyads, that was like that there were so many policies going on, and for 9 years they ruled over there, like so many emperors, so many caliphs came from this particular dynasty. Now after these Umayyads came Abbasids. Abbasids had a revolution. We should talk about them as well in the next topic, that is the Abbasid revolution. Now the Abbasid revolution. Now you know what, that till 750 CE the Umayyads had been in power, like they were ruling over the Islamic Empire, the Arab Peninsula, over the city you could say. But now they had been declined, overthrown by a new dynasty that was from the origin of Mecca, again Mecca, because you know that the reason was simple. It was just similar to the overthrowing of the third caliphate as well. Third caliphate, who was the third caliphate? It was Uthman. Now the overthrowing of Uthman and you could say that Ali was just simple, because they were taking Islam as just their, you could say that as just their protecting thing. Like they were using, you know what, that during that time what happened, that most people in the Rashidun caliphates, all of the caliphs were from the Quraysh region, Quraysh tribe you could say, and that is why they were promoting most of their Quraysh tribes. And that same happened here. What happened, that Umayyads were promoting more and more Syrian military commanders, weren't it? And that is why Iranian army soldiers were resisting their dominance. So there were many reasons behind the overthrowing. You know what, a large movement named as Dawa took place to overthrow this Umayyad dynasty and to replace it with a new dynasty that was known as Abbasid dynasty, whose leader was from the family, or was, you could say that, descended from the family of Abbas. Abbas was the uncle of the Prophet. So like so much family connection is there, isn't it? So you could say that there were many reasons behind their overthrowing. What were they? First was that they were including Christians, including Jews, many different types of religions in a same court. That could be that Islamic community did not like it during that time. Now Syrian soldiers were resisted because of their dominance by the Iranian soldiers, and what's more, that there was a region, this dynasty, Abbasid dynasty, came from a region that was Khorasan. Now this Khorasan was a region where there was a mixed population of Arab and Iran. So there was Arab-Iran mixed population, and what's more, that these Irans were scorned to race conscious by the Arabs. So there was kind of racial discrimination to those Iranians, you could say. Now you know what, that there were many, like those Iranian Muslims were also known as Mawali. Now in Hindi it could be an abusive word, but during that time they were known as Mawali. So you could say that just like there was so much disrespect towards them, and they could go to any kind of you could say any kind of line out of limit to overthrow Umayyads dynasty, and that is why this all happened. And what's more, that Umayyads dynasty had promised for those people to have tax concessions and money concessions, but they were never fulfilled. Those promises were never fulfilled. So this Abbasid dynasty promised that it will restore the main beliefs of Islam, would give concessions, would decline this authoritarian, that is centralization of the Islamic polity. There would not be so much centralization, and that is why Abbasid was established by the people, by the Ummas, you could say by the Muslims. So you could say that now Abbasid dynasty had been into power after 750 CE. Now what happened, that it took over all the regions, like it even commanded Iranian military commanders, Iraq military commanders, those were in now power. But what it saw that it had been against the centralization polity, but was compelled to again introduce it, because in such a large territory, how could he rule over it without any centralization policy, because there wasn't any kind of technology during that time as well as we do have today. So there were many restrictions during that time as well, and that is why he found it very important for centralization policy to be established. So he was compelled or forced to establish it again. Then what happened? Let's talk about it with the next topic, that is breakup of the caliphate and the rise of sultanates. So break up the caliphate and the rise up of the sultanates. Now let's talk about the breakup of the caliphate as well. Now till now Abbasid dynasty has been ruling, but till 10th century there were many things going on that rose to the power of the sultanates. What happened that in 810 a civil war broke out between the supporters of two people. Now those two were the sons of the caliph of the Abbasid dynasty, and once again Shia Muslims or Shiism, will discuss Shiism versus Sunni orthodoxy began. Now what happened that Shiism and Sunni orthodoxy were now fighting for power, and that is when some minor sultanates grew up, like Samanids and Tahidrids, and we have like some other sultanates as well that were minor sultanates. Now sultanates is a completely different word from caliph. Like you could say that the main purpose of the caliph was to spread Islamic religion as a religion, but the main purpose of the sultanate is to conquer territories, act as a king, emperor, or in Arabic language there is a word that is 𝓒𝓱𝓪, that means kings of kings. So you could say that now they would not be bounded by religion, they would not be bounded by Islamic religion, beliefs, those kind of things, but they would act as a king, and that's why many minor sultanates grew up, and out of them some were very important as well, like we have Buyids. Now Buyids were from the Shiism community, Shiism clan, and they grew into power as well, like they had conquered. You know what, that by the 10th century, what happened, by the, you could say the 9th century, not even that time, what happened that this Abbasid dynasty had lost its power. You know what, that the Abbasid dynasty had transferred their capital from Damascus to Baghdad when it was established. So now they were ruling over just some few parts of the world, that was Central Asia and parts of Iraq and some part of North Africa. You could say that they were ruling over very few parts now. That was also taken by Buyids in 945. So in 10th century those regions were conquered by Buyids from the Abbasid dynasty. However, they were not they were not killed or they were not suppressed. They were still caliphs, but their powers were not limited. They were still the power of legitimacy. But now you know what, that like the same happened in the Roman Empire as well. Now these caliphs did have some importance, like sages in India had, but the main king would be different, that would be the sultanate. Besides that, you know what, that this community that is we talked about with the sultanate, this Buid sultanate wanted that they were ruling over these regions and caliphs would be there. But there was another sultanate that came up from the same clan, that is Shizm clan, and that was Fatimids. Now Fatimids said that they were the descendants of Fatima, who was the daughter of the Prophet. So very long connection. So you could say that they were said to have descendants of the family of Prophet, and that is why they should be in power, and they wanted to rule over the Islamic world. And that is why they took over the parts of Egypt. Now that they took over the parts of Egypt, like they were ruling over Egypt literally, and they got into power. Now many things happened in the Islamic world, like many small wars were fought between some minor sultanates, big sultanates as well. Now not just one language was used, because you know what, that there are different sultanates, so definitely there would be different languages as well. Earlier there was just one language, that was Arabic language, but now Persian rose up. So you could say that there were many languages other than that were used as well. Now that was, you could say that there were two powerful parties. The third party also came up, you know, that the Turks came up. Turks were from the region of Turkmenistan. They were nomadic tribes, and that they came up as powerful military warriors and horse riders. So they were very powerful warriors or horse riders, you could say. They came up as slaves, soldiers, you could say. Now what happened that now in 961 a new sultanate was formed, that was formed by Al-Taqid. Now Al-Taqid formed a new sultanate, that was Ghaznvids. Now this Ghaznvids was consolidated by Mahmud of Ghazni, that ruled over from 998 to 1030. Now he has so many military commanders from different regions, like from India as well, from Iraq as well, and he had conquered many parts of the world as well. So you could say that was it. Now besides that, there was another thing that needs to be noticed, that is Seljuk Turks. Now these Seljuk Turks were also very important. Earlier they were taken as slaves, because those earlier sultanates like the Budians and this, you could say, Fatimids, wanted to rule over the Islamic world. So they were taken in as slaves as well. So they were the slaves. The Seljuk Turks were the slaves. But later on, two brothers came up, that were Chageri Beg and Tulgri Beg. Now then these two, you could say that these two brothers came up, they rose to the power. The Seljuk Turks rose to the power and even conquered the Egypt region, because now they wanted to be in power. So they took over the Egypt region. So you could say that during that time there were many sultanates. During the 10th century there were so many sultanates going on, like by 1000, you could say that 1030, this Egypt was conquered by the Seljuk Turks, and later on you could say that they were also, you know what, that it was very important to be you could say that to be have legitimate sense of you could say the sense of title as well. Like for example, Mahmud of Ghazni was a son of slave. Now he wanted to take the title of consolidator as a king. That is why he took the legitimacy by the caliphs. So now caliphs were now acting as peaceful, religious, spiritual leaders, and those were the kings, emperors. So you could say that is why caliphs had their own power, but now they could not command the military, the army, and they could not go to the wars. They were only some religious, spiritual leaders with so much of power of their self as well. And now what happened that this was all, like you could say that after the dynasty came up, like you could say Abbasid dynasty came up, and after it the sultanates grew up, and after that we should talk about the Crusades as well. What happened that in 11th, in 12th and in 13th century, what happened that between 11th to 13th century, this Islamic world was in a crisis. Like there were so many things going on, so many conflicts were there between the Christians and the Islams, Muslims you could say. So you could say that there were many conflicts, Crusades as well. So let's talk about them as well for the next topic, that is the Crusades. So the Crusades. Now let's talk about the, you could say, the Crusades between the Christians or Christianity and the Islamic world, the Islamic people. Now what happened now? Christians were considered as a book of people by the Islams, like Muslims you could say, by those who followed Islam religion. Now what happened that Jerusalem was conquered by the Arabs in 638 AD. Now Jerusalem was a place where birth of Jesus Christ happened. Like you might know that Jesus Christ had been born in Jerusalem, and that is why Christians still believe in crucifixion and resurrection of the Jesus Christ in this region. But now that it had been conquered by the Arabs, so definitely it would become a Muslim city. All the churches would be broken down, churches would be broken down, and now mosques will be built. It's very simple. And you know what, that hostility between Christendom and the Islamic world were getting more intense. How was it so? You know what, that in the medieval period, many Normans, some Slavs you could say, not slaves, Slavs, and many people had been converted into Christianity, so as to be the main enemy would be the Islams. You could say that the Islamic world, the main enemy, they would be the Arabs, you could say. Now what happened that there was a movement in, you could say that there is a movement in Christianity, that is peace of God. Now peace of God states that you would not fight, the Christians don't have to fight against some minority social groups like churchmen, some those who are vulnerable. They should not fight like that, and also should think about the economic order as well. But it is clearly stated that you can find those who are the enemies of God, who are infidels, that means that are the non-believers of Christendom. And that is why, you know what, that the military warriors and the clergy people, the first and second class, had been planning like such a war against the Islamic world that it would not affect their economic sphere as well, that was being done from agriculture and trade, and wanted to be against Islamic world as they have seen them as a main enemy of themselves. So that is why, you know what, that many wars had been fought from 1095 to 1291 CE, and these wars were in the coastal areas in the east of Mediterranean Sea. These wars were known as Crusades or Crusades. Now crusades are basically the wars between that they were crushed through each other. Like there were crusades between those communities. One was the Christianity, the second was the Islam. Now there were crusades between them, and many wars were fought against them. What happened that when Shah, like you could say that the last descendant of Seljuk empire, not empire, the Sultanate. Now when last the Shah died, you could say that Shah was the name of the Sultan. When he died, he was from the Seljuk Sultanate. So when he died, there was disintegration of his whole empire, and that is why the Byzantine Empire, from the Byzantine Empire there was a king whose name was Alexius I. Now this Alexius I saw this an opportunity for conquering the Asia Minor region, the Syria region, and there was another king who was like you could say the Pope Urban II. Now this Pope Urban II wanted to revive Christianity in those regions. Not to mention, you have to mention that the Holy Land of Palestine was also conquered by the Arabs. So of course they would have to revive their land, you could say, of Christianity, and that is why they collaborated with each other and fought against the Islamic world. That is what we call crusades. Now, the first crusade took place between 1098 to 1099, and it was fought by definitely the Arabs, all those who were Islamic, like Arab Empire, Arabian Empire, you could say Islamic Empire, and the military from France and Italy. So from these regions they were fought, and finally Jerusalem was claimed by European Christians. You could say they had claimed their Jerusalem because it was their holy lands, and many Muslims were slaughtered, many Jews were killed inhumanely. They were treated as inhumane ways, you could say. So that is why you could say that was the first crusade. You could say that Baghdad, that was the capital, was also being taken, like some parts of it were also taken, and many other areas were also conquered. The most important one was, of course, the you could say that the capturing of Jerusalem. After that, in 1144, the Arabian Empire, the Islamic Empire, you could say that Islamic world had conquered or had taken back, it would be good to use this, had taken back Edessa. And when this happened, again a second crusade happened by the demand of Pope. Now, by the demand of Pope, the second crusade was fought from 1045 to 1049. In this, the soldiers were from Germany and from France. They wanted to take Damascus region, but they could not do so. And instead, Jerusalem again was taken by the Islamic world. It was again converted into a Muslim empire. Now, what happened that Jerusalem was taken by an emperor whose name was Shah al-Din. Now, this Shah al-Din was a king. Now, he had treated those Christians in humane ways. It was not inhumane ways. They were not killed. They were still living. Christians were still living as pilgrims and other people, merchants. But the city was converted into a Muslim city. The city that was Jerusalem, the main church of 𝓒𝓱𝓪 was given to the custody of Christians, but all the other churches were of course would be broken down and would be converted into mosques because it had to become a Muslim city. Then again a third crusade happened after it, that was in 1189. Now in 1189 again the crusade was fought, in which again this Islamic Empire had won, like had defeated the other party, the Christians, and again the regions were conquered. Like some regions of Islamic Empire were also conquered, but they were not to be bragged about, like they were the small regions. And by 1291 the Islamic Empire had cleared off all the Christians, all the crusaders from their region, so that in future there would not be any crusades. And even after that, you know that the European Christian lost interest in the military invasions of this Islamic world. Now they wanted to focus more and more on their economic spheres, in their development, and that is why we see that in Europe there is development as well today, because they had been taken steps from the past history as well. So that was why you could say that is why they are developed countries. And so from these crusades, what happened that, you know what, they were in the first crusades, it was known as Frankish invasion. They were the rulers of Egypt. They had taken 4 cities of Palestine that was known as 𝓒𝓱𝓪. Now these 𝓒𝓱𝓪 were very strengthened, but in the second crusade they had been, you could say that they were now less strengthened, like their power was decreasing. So that is also very important, that those 4 cities that were taken were known as 𝓒𝓱𝓪. So that is how everything that happened, like there were so many wars going on, hostility between these 2 different community groups, and that is what we call social conflict as well. Now the next topic here is that economy, agriculture, urbanization and commerce. So economy, agriculture, urbanization and commerce. Now we have seen about the conquering, you could say that about different caliphs, different dynasties over the Islamic world, and we have also seen its crusades. But we should have a different sphere as well, that is economic sphere. So now let's talk about the economic sphere of the Islamic State in which there were three most important aspects. First was the agriculture, second was the urbanization, and the third is of course commerce. Now first is agriculture. You know what, that agriculture was practiced over a large scale, at a large scale as well, in the Islamic state. Now as they have conquered many more lands, many more territories, in new conquered territories, no change was made for the land, for the owning of land by big peasants or small peasants. The lands were still owned by small peasants or big peasants, and those lands that were abandoned by the aristocracies after the wars were now taken by the state. That is the government, that is the monarch system, you could say. And so you could say that agriculture were practiced at a large scale as well. New crops were discovered, were grown as well, that were brinjal, spinach, cotton, orange, and many other crops as well. So you could say that new crops were also grown, and the government also supported it in the Nile Valley of Egypt. Now in the Nile Valley of Egypt, it also supported for digging wells, for building dams, and digging wells of course, and for irrigation systems as well. So I would not say the government, but the monarchy was supporting them as well. The caliphs were supporting them as well. Now the main issue here was that how it produced economy, like how could it contribute to economy. Mainly for the national treasury, the tax was levied on the produce. Now the Muslims had to pay 1/10 of the produce as tax, but non-Muslims had to pay around half to 1/5, half to fifth part of the produce, depending upon their cultivation, land, size of the land, produce. So you could say that now what would happen? Definitely there would be conversion into Muslim more and more, because people would not want to pay tax that much, like half of the produce. That was just too much. So you could say that is why they wanted to convert, and had been converted as well. So that could be a problem for the national treasury, for the taxpayer. You could say that the authority that was taking the tax. And that is why the caliphs allowed all the military commanders, all the officials of the government to have their salaries from the revenue, from the tax revenue, you could say agriculture revenue, and now that they could collect it from any non-Muslim or Muslim that had been converted as much as they wanted as their salaries. So you could say that is how agriculture shaped the economy of the Islamic state. Now comes the urbanization. You know what, that many new cities appeared, were now established, you could say that, in Islamic state. Earlier also they were, but now more and more cities getting more and more dividing, you could say that they were diminishing, and getting more and more new cities were being established, you could say. Like for example, we have Cairo city in Egypt. Now that is, you know what, that during the time period of like the sultanate that we were talking about. And when Fatimids took over the Egypt, they had conquered it, you know that, and they had converted the capital as Cairo city. That was known as Qahira city, but later came to be known as Cairo. You know what, that many words that we use in English, like magazines and like checks, many other words have their origin from the Arabic language as well. So that has its importance as well. So you could say that many cities like Cairo in Egypt, and there's a word Misr, many cities, garrison cities. You know what, that many cities, why were they even formed? Because soldiers wanted to live in them, and that is why those garrison like cities were in Misr. Misr, that is an Arabic word for Egypt, and even now many people use it, like many people use Misr instead of Egypt, and of course in Hindi we talk it like that. So you could say that in Misr there were so many garrison cities as well, like Cairo and like Fustat, that was earlier the capital of Egypt from the conquering of like Fatimids. So before the conquerance of the Fatimids, before the arrival of Fatimids, Fustat was the capital of Egypt, and the old cities were also there, like Sadigamant and many other cities, Damascus, we had Baghdad. These were the also cities. And let's talk about the structure of the cities as well. Now what happened that cities, there would be a city wall, as all of you know that. Now in the central part would live the officials, you could say that those officials, merchants, big caliphs, you could say, big people, the first class people, you could say, they would live it there. And in every city there were two most important things that were, first was the congregational mosque and the second was the market that could be seen, like the mosque that could be seen from a long distance as well, as it was built in such an architecture. Now in the outer circle of the city would live the ordinary citizens and the soldiers. Now they would have their own shop, own market filled with so many shopkeepers, and it would be very clean market. They would have their own public bath, they would have their own mosques, churches or synagogues. Now synagogues is a place of worship for the Jews. Now in the outskirts of the city would live the poor urban people. Now they would have their own shops that were considered as dirty, as they were for tanning or butchering. So you could say that is the system of a city, how city was formed. Now after, beyond the city wall were the inns. Now those who wanted to come and the city wall had been closed down, they could rest in those inns and cemeteries. So you could say that is how city was formed, and it could be helpful in the economic production as well, because in city there was so much population, as population was growing much and more, like there was ever growing population, and so as their food grain demands also grow up, demand for luxuries also grow up. So many things, if the population is growing, then definitely the demands would be growing, and if the demands would be growing, of course the production would be growing. If the production is growing, then of course it would contribute to the economy of the country. Now during that time many people were growing, like so much population was there, urbanization had been done, that contributed to the demand for luxuries. And that is why, you know what, that Arabs and Iranians during that time in the medieval period had monopolized the maritime trade between China, India and them. There were two main routes, that were Red Sea and the second was the Gulf of Persia. Now these two were the main trade routes between these countries, between the Asia, you could say. In Asia we have India and China, and between those Iranian countries like Iran and the Arab Empire, the Islamic State, you could say. Now what happened that those things that could be transported at such a long distance, like for example spices, textiles and gunpowder, these were transported, these were traded, not just transported, these were actually traded and had been monopolized by the Arabian and Iranian empires. Now what happened that they were transported over the sea routes, and from there on the camel back they would be you could say supplied to the Damascus cities, to any of the cities where they had to transported, where they had to be transmissioned. Now from there comes the word magazine, like those when they were traveling on camel backs. What would happen that at such time when there was like monsoon season, you know what, monsoon also has origin from the Arabic language. There is a word that is mausim. So from mausim word monsoon has come, and during that time the carts would be bigger, that would be called as magazines. Magazine is the origin word for magazines. So you could say that there are many words who have origin from the Arabic language as well. Now the third point is that, you know what, that we talk about commerce. What about the commerce? In the eastern part of the Islamic State, in eastern part commerce would be going on, like so much transactions between merchants, traders were going on, so much trade was being continued. And you know what is the most important or the best thing about it was that new you could say that new methods of payments and transactions were being introduced. For example, instead of going to hand cash to cash, what happened that instead of handing cash from hand to hand, you will have to go from one place to another, because during that time there wasn't any e-banking was there. What they did was that there was paper cash system. What we have checks as for present time. During that time they were called as saks, that is the origin word from checks. So you could say that during that time when these were introduced, paper billing system and transaction systems were introduced, what happened that those big merchants didn't have to go from one place to another place for handing cash. Now that could be done with paper. So merchants and bankers were using it. And in Islamic State, what happened that in the cities, as many people were living, and they had demand for their luxuries and for all the things, those were demanded from India and China as they were monopolized. That was also supporting, contributing towards the economy, and as the new methods were increasing, it would be more convenient for them. And you know what, in merchants from India, from this Islamic State were also going to India for the trade ecosystem. It was not just from India, it was going on. So from this region also were going to India and China on from the sea routes, you could say, that were mainly, you could say that they were mainly there, and mainly this kind of commerce was being done. Now in Islamic State, all kind of money transaction was you could say that was respected, was allowed. Instead of one thing, that it should not be unlawful, disrespectful transaction. For example, the transaction that is you could say the interest bearing transaction was considered as unlawful. However, in many of the cases it did happen, like we have some records of Jizya records and many trades. So you could say that they were still continued, and in many cases what happened was that there were transactions between two people. One would give money to the other, and then the other would return it in different kind of coins and would diminish the interest, saying that this was the different kind of coin, you will have to give me interest instead. So you could say that they were also some kind of rammicking as well. So you could say that is how the economic sphere of the Islamic State was formed. Now the next topic here is learning and culture. So learning and culture. Now let's talk about the learning in the Islamic State as well as the culture of Islamic State. Now first, the culture has been given in your book, so let's talk about it. Now what happened that between 9th and 10th century, and afterwards the most significant culture emerged in the Islamic State. Like for example, there were like so many people came up and many ideas came up that it was arguing with the orthodox Islamic beliefs as well. So what were those? How did they say the universe? Like there were many mystical questions among their minds that were, how do you see the universe, about the God, about the day of judgment, how you get the salvation in the day of judgment. So there were many questions rising, and there were some scholars that were known as ulams. Now these ulamas came up with knowledge and gave some beliefs as well, on the basis of which there were 4 different schools that were established, that were Hanbali, Safi, Hanafi, and you could say that Maliki. So Maliki, Hani and Safi and Hanbali were established as the 4 schools in 8th and 9th century. Now these like beliefs of these people were not spread that much, were argued as well. After them came Sufis. Now Sufis' main propaganda was to spread like compassion, pantheism. There was the main belief. Pantheism is that for oneness, to have connection with God, that God and his son, like his child, should have united soul, like their soul should be united. For example, like you could say that a person and his maker, that is the God, should have their soul as connected. So there were some beliefs, you could say pantheism, compassion, love, you could say love with the God should be there. So Sufis were acknowledged as well, and they even argued with some like orthodox beliefs of the Muslim community. Now besides that, there was also so many methods of learning in the Islamic State. First was that during that time there were many other, like Aristotle, many other great scientists were there. For example, like many Greek scholars and in from India, mathematics, astronomy was also adopted. You know what, that during the Abbasid dynasty there was Greek culture at its decline, and the Abbasid dynasty's ruler had commanded or ordered that those cultures should be translated into Arabic, and then they could be spread into their country as well. So the Islamic State was not just confined or like solitary confined, it was also adopting others' beliefs, like not beliefs, religious beliefs, but yeah, in learning methods it did. For astronomy, mathematics, different ways of expressing. And there was this person who was NCERT. Now this NCERT was a doctor by profession and was against the idea that you will be resurrected on the day of judgment as through the physical. He was a doctor, so of course he will not believe in those things, because he would give some the physical body, the structure of the body, the biological thing, the doctory things. Besides that, you know what, that he even wrote books that was canon of medicine, in which he told about about 675 drugs used. So you could say that he had such a large knowledge and so many beliefs, like so many givings as well. But instead, you know what, that there was a strong opposition by the Muslim communities, by the scholars of the Muslim communities. It would be obvious because the main belief of theirs was heard. After that, there was a role of poems in the Islamic State as well, for example Mahmud of Ghazni. Now Mahmud of Ghazni had so many poets around him. Why was that? Because poets always praised whoever was in power, so that they would be given some money, arms, gifts. So of course for these purposes they would praise the king, whoever is in power. Then come the writers, they would write about them inscriptions. So you could say that learning and culture was so much in the Islamic State as well. For example, besides poets, many other things were also there, like different languages. Books were written in different languages. In that era, a person with creative imagination and good command with language was a person with so much talent, because he had skills of communication. So there are many, there is 1,000 Nights and One Nights, 1,001 Nights actually it is. So that book was also famous. So you could say that in different parts of the Islamic State, many poets and many authors came up with creative imaginations. Many books were written, those for documents were also there. So many things that we get today, they are the source of history as well. Now the next and last topic of this chapter is paper, Janiza records and history. Now paper, Janiza records and the history. What happened that all of you know that paper that first came up in China. That is very obvious. We have covered it in the previous classes history as well. Now that paper was started in China. Before that there was obviously papyri that was used. Now what happened that in Abbasid dynasty, many of these, not that an Abbasid dynasty, it was Abbasid dynasty in 751. Now what happened that in 751 around 10,000 of these paper makers, of these invaders from China, were made into captives by the Abbasid dynasty. And what happened that for the next 100 years, what happened that paper was being made by those and infrastructure was good, but it was against the law of Islam that you would monopolize, and that is why paper was now being started, being manufactured in the Islamic State as well. So that was a good thing. And you know what, that we have found millions of records in an Iranian synagogue. Synagogue is a place of worship for Jews. So we have found millions of traces of Janiza records. Janiza records that were for the Jews. It was a belief of Jews, it is still a belief of Jews that the document whichever contains the name of God would not be destroyed, and that is why in 1856 through excavation, through many things, these Janiza records were found by the archaeologists, by different historians, and these were transactions, day-to-day conversations between merchants and about letters, ceremonial speeches. So these Gen Z records have so much contribution to the history as well. So you could say that the paper that was manufactured in China was last started in the Islamic State as well. And you know what, that because of this, of course, papyri will be left behind, and that is why what happened, that you know what, that paper during that time was made out of linen, and that is why in Egypt there were robberies in graves for mummies wrappings. You could say that mummies wrappings, mummy, as all of you know, that are in the pyramids of Egypt, like in fantasy you might have also heard. So for the wrappings of mummy, there were robberies into the graves, because those wrappings of mummies were made from linen, which was very good for producing paper, and those robbers could sell it to the paper makers and could earn money. So just think about it, just such a low strata that they gave, like from grave they had to rob. Just think about the situation. So you could say that is all we have covered in this chapter. Now firstly, we talked about the rise of Islam in Arabia. We saw different tribes were there, and how like there was establishment of you could say the Prophet Muhammad, how established Islamic it's Islamic religion. And after that we saw that how different things covered, like caliphates, the first Rashidunit caliphates. Then after that came up Umayyads, Abbasid dynasty. After that we talked about, like in Abbasid dynasty there was so much cultural things going on in the Islamic state. We also talked about learning in that period of time. After that came like sultanates came up, Mahmud of Ghazni, the Fatimids, the Sultanate, and different sultanates. And we also talked about the crusades between the Christendom and the Islamic world. We talked about the overall economic activities going on in the Islamic state. So that is all we have covered in this chapter. I have covered all the topic and subtopic. Now comes the end to our story. After this there will be invasion by the Mongols, in which that was the biggest invasion. Like in medieval world, you could say that just the thing about that nomadic empire came to invasion. So that is one of the rarest things in the world. So that will be discussed in the next chapter of this section. So that is all we have covered. I have covered all the topics and subtopics, and the next themes or the chapters of this book will be covered in the further upcoming videos. So stay tuned for upcoming videos. Thank you very much.